Thank you, Jürgen. And it is my pleasure to be here. And I want to tell you that you're very fortunate to have Jürgen here. He was our professor of practice at Syracuse University for just one semester. But in that one semester, he made such a difference with a group of students that he taught in his studio. And I would do anything to get Jürgen to come back, but I know I probably would have to fight with all of you to keep him here. I want to thank the Technical University and the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and Art for the invitation, the wonderful and generous invitation to come here. And I especially want to thank Jürgen Joner for his recommending me for this invitation and for the opportunity to come here. This is my first time in Trondheim, my first time in Norway. I've traveled a lot around the world, but somehow I missed Norway, and now I can put it on my bucket list. I've been to Norway, and I will come back to Norway many times, I think, after getting this little taste. And I want to thank Jürgen for the wonderful tour of Trondheim yesterday. It's a beautiful, beautiful city, town, I guess it is. And you're all fortunate that you have a university located here within walking distance of Trondheim, of downtown Trondheim. Let me begin by asking you a question. And I'm going to pick a couple of you out, so prepare yourself because I'm going to ask you, this is your application test. What is a facade? This is not a trick question. Just tell me what you think a facade is. Okay, that was the word I was looking for. She said that it's perhaps the face of a building. And yes, perhaps it is the face of a building. In fact, that probably is the traditional definition of what a facade is. And in fact, the word facade comes from the word face. But is it the only definition of what a facade is? Uh-oh.
I would call it the skin, maybe.
The skin.
If you compare it to a human body, it would be what contains, well, and preserves the internal parts, and that everything functions.
But is it only the skin? And I ask that because your whole body is covered by skin, but there's only one part of your body that is the facade, or is the face. Yes?
Well, the face is the only thing, well, that's what's seen. But if you say skin, it's kind of what contains everything.
That's true. The face has its own set of functions. The rest of the body does other things. And it's all wrapped in skin. But if we take the skin and put it over here and take the face and put it over there, can we call the skin the facade? Or has something happened? Have we removed something from the building? Now, maybe that's a rhetorical question. You don't necessarily have to answer that. What I'm getting at is that perhaps the definition of facade, at least the conventional definition of facade, has changed over time. And most notably, I think it's changed within the 20th century. And it's been a subtle change. It's a change that has been sort of stealthy. We haven't really maybe noticed that the idea of the facade has changed. Yet we accept that the covering of the building, the skin of the building, is maybe also the facade. What I want to question today is the veracity of that idea, whether or not we can just simply say that any surface on a building is the facade. And if we can agree that maybe that's not true, that not any surface, not any treatment can be considered a facade, then how do we make the distinction between what is a facade and what is not a facade? Let me read a little introduction to you. This is an economical way of getting out a lot of information in a short period of time. It can be argued that historically the polemic of architecture has been largely centered on the art of the facade, For more than 5 centuries following the onset of the Renaissance and well before, the exterior vertical surface has served as the primary vehicle for registering meaning within the built environment. Its traditional role as a mediator between the private domain and the public realm made it a critical architectural component. However, in the early part of the 20th century, the impact of the modern movement and the ideology of the freestanding object significantly changed architectural attitudes towards the building facade and about making of the urban fabric. The view of the facade as a critical mediator between the internal and external conditions of site, of program, of structure, and symbol diminished, as did its generative role within the design process. Architects became less adept at producing well-crafted facades. If you look around you, there are an enormous number of bad facades. Yet the people that made those facades are architects. Architects trained like all of you, and yet somehow they've forgotten how to make a good facade. Consequently, the vertical surface lost its preeminent role as an architectural element and much of its capacity as a communicative artifact. The facade as a building component embodying an idea integral to the making of the whole structure became merely a surface seen more as an afterthought. It is not a coincidence that along with the diminution of the art of facade making, there has been a corresponding impoverishment of the entire urban realm. This is particularly a problem in the United States. I mean, there is still, it seems to me, in Europe, there is a regard for the urban realm and how that is defined through building surfaces. But if you go to the United States, you'll find that in many cases we've destroyed our public spaces and we've replaced them with really awful buildings that no longer operate as communicative artifacts within the civic domain, within the public domain. Most critics of this condition maintain that the problem is essentially one of representation. That is to say, the loss of the means by which a building can effectively convey messages of use, materiality, technique, cultural symbol, and civic value has been lost. An architecture parlant, an architecture that speaks, has become an architecture muet, an architecture that is silent. Exacerbating this problem is that the fact that in the past 25 years, something strange has happened in the schools of architecture in the United States. And I can only speak for the US. I can't speak for European schools. We have stopped talking about the building facade as an important site of representation and meaning. We have stopped requiring students to invest as much thought and energy into the making of the vertical surface as they do into the building volume or the building plan. This is not to say that there is not an interest in the building envelope as a technological and performative site, but technology has become an end in itself rather than a means to an end that speaks to matters of culture, of context, and of richness of meaning. Now, partly as a result of this, I started teaching a course called Facade as Idea. I've been doing this now for about 10 or 12 years. I did this because I was very concerned about what was happening at Syracuse. The fact that more and more my colleagues, my good colleagues, were talking less and less about the vertical surface as an important site of representation. And more students were leaving to the end of the process any consideration of what they might do to address the issue of the building facade. I was talking to Jürgen as we walked back from lunch, and I mentioned to him that isn't it strange that all too often when you ask a student, where is your facade? What happened to the facade? The answer all too often is, well, I didn't get to it. I didn't have time to get to the facade, as though the facade is like a punctuation mark on a sentence that's at the end of some other kind of narrative, that it's at the end of a linear process instead of something that's part of the integral part of the design process as something that is you consider maybe from the very beginning, like we consider volumetric massing from the beginning, the way we consider the plan organization, the distribution of the building program from the beginning. And this really astounded me, and it disturbed me greatly, enough so that I began teaching this course. It consists of 26 lectures that do not attempt to create a theory of the facade or do not attempt to trace the history of the facade, but rather just simply to talk about the building facade as a phenomenon of material, of surface treatment, of organization, of composition, of relationship between inside and outside, of relationship to site, to context, to climate, as a phenomenological condition, how we perceive a building through its facade. That surface, that is the very first thing that you see when you approach a building, and it's the last thing you see when you leave a building, and yet we don't talk about it anymore. It's the surface that when you go to a book and you want to identify a building, the image of the building is not its plan usually, it's not the section of the building, it's the elevation or it's the facade of the building. This is how a building face speaks to the public domain. And yet, any real extended conversation about this seems to have been lost. And so I've developed this course. I can tell you that it's I'm pleased to say, I'm very proud to say it's a very popular course. I have to turn students away. I can only accommodate 40 students at a time in this course. But that's a good sign. It tells me that students are hungry to understand this issue of the building facade because they are being deprived of any conversation about that in their other studios. Like Magritte's lovers here, something has happened to the face, to the building face. We have, through whatever reason, culturally, technologically, intentionally or otherwise, we have arrived at a point where more and more we are obscuring the face of the building, or we are obscuring the idea of the face of the building and replacing it with a shroud, maybe, replacing it with a decorative treatment that although they may be interesting, and there are some exquisite buildings, and I'll show you some beautifully detailed buildings, the skins are just extraordinary, but they're not facades. And we should not call them facades. I mean, that will be basically my argument. Just as Magritte says that this is not a pipe, I mean, his iconic image, all he really intended with this painting was to make the point that this is not the actual pipe. It's a representation of the pipe. It's not the pipe. And so he says it's not a pipe. It's a painting of the original artifact, of the original pipe. And we should not confuse the two. And there is, many, sort of thesis papers that have been written about the issue of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. The famous title of the article by Walter Benjamin still resonates with us today, even many, many years after he wrote that we live in such a mediated time that we have lost a sense of what is real and what is not real, or what is a facade and what is not a facade. I would say that this is not a facade. It's an interesting building. I happened to have the opportunity to go there last year and look closely at it, go inside it. It's an interesting building, and I think it served its purpose as a kind of artifact in the landscape that draws attention to itself. It has a kind of compelling quality about it, but it's not a facade. None of these surfaces, I would say, satisfy what I would think would be a kind of conventional definition of what a facade is, what it has been historically, and maybe what it should continue to be when we talk about facade. That's not to say that this is a bad building. I want to make the distinction between being critical of calling this a facade when I don't think it is a facade, and being critical of the building itself. I'm not being critical of the building. I'm only being critical of the notion that we present this as a kind of set of surfaces and that we then call them facades. I would say that they're not. I would say that this is a facade. This happens to be the Palazzo Davanzati in Florence. And it's really quite a wonderful facade. Historically, it's very significant because it is symbolic of, it's representative of a moment in history when the idea, the art of facade making began to find its way into the domestic realm, into the secular realm, into civic architecture like this palace that is a private building owned by a family, and they invested in composing the facade in such a way that it begins to speak to the public domain. These windows that you see there don't necessarily have anything to do with the organization of the building behind it. In fact, the organization of the building behind it still followed sort of medieval typologies. It wasn't until later that the Renaissance started to reorganize the building plans. But this clearly is creating a sense of order, of composition, of culture, of distinction that is saying something. It's sending a message out to the public domain about the owner of this building and his cultivation and ability, his means, his financial means, to be able to make a beautiful facade like this. And this was the beginning of perhaps the modern idea of facade making. And then we have this building, a great building. If you've never had the opportunity to go to it, you should. It's now a museum, and so you can visit it. You need to make an appointment to get there, but you can go visit the site of Philip Johnson's glass house and all of the other structures on this wonderful site in Connecticut. And when you go there, you'll find that this building has no pretense about making a facade. It represents, first of all, a kind of technological advance over this building. It is space that's contained within the thinnest envelope, a membrane of glass that is supported by very thin steel columns with this overarching roof. And it's not at all about making a face. It's about making a place within the garden that allows the garden to move into the building. And when you're in the building, the space of the building moves out into the garden. So it's about a kind of correspondence or communing between interior and exterior space. And he does it brilliantly. I mean, Johnson almost outdoes, his mentor, Mies van der Rohe, with this building. But I'm putting it here as as being emblematic of being symbolic of not only the technical trajectory from here to here, but also a matter of intentionality between that as an idea of surface versus this as an idea of surface. And this is where the problem, I think, lies now in terms of this notion of facade. If I asked you to raise your hands and I asked the question, do you think this is a facade? I would be willing to bet that everybody would say, yes, this is a facade. It meets all of the kind of conventional sort of definitions of what a building facade should be. And it's a beautiful facade. This is Victor Horta's house in Belgium, the Tassel house in Brussels. And it is what we would consider a traditional facade and a beautifully detailed and refined sort of idea of facade. So we can agree on that. But now let me ask you, would you agree with me if I said that this was a facade? Or would you disagree with me? If you agree that this is a facade, if we all agree that this is a facade, then it raises the question of what is a facade? If we say that this is a facade and this is also a facade, how can two buildings so different in terms of their material, their intentionality, their relationship to their context, how can two buildings so different still submit to the idea of having a facade? So what has happened to the definition of facade that allows it to embrace not only this building, but this building as well? If you disagree and say, no, this is not a facade, then the question is, what is it? Facade, yes. Facade, no. Then what has happened to the facade? In this case, it appears as though maybe the facade has been purposely taken away and replaced with just simply some kind of markings on these metal panels. Now, this happens to be a very interesting building. It is a hotel, a small hotel, boutique hotel in Rotterdam, and it sits within this historic context. So clearly it's setting up a kind of dialogue between the historic context and the tectonic context of the brick buildings and itself. And that was part of the idea. But that's an idea about a relationship between an object and its context, not so much about facade. So is this or is this not a facade? Can we agree on that, or can we disagree on that? So this begs the question of what is a facade? So where do we begin to figure out what a facade is if we're not exactly sure, if there appears to be maybe a lot of different definitions of what a facade is? It's a face, it's the skin, it is the front of the building. Well, no, it can be any front of the building. A building can have more than one front. So where do we go? Well, let's start with the most obvious place, and that's the dictionary. And this is an English language dictionary, but I would believe if we went to a Norwegian dictionary or a German dictionary or an Italian dictionary, we'd find the same definition. And the primary definition in all dictionaries that I've seen is the front of a building, especially an imposing or decorative one. Now, this appears to be a very generalized description of what a facade is, but in fact, within its generality, there is a high degree of specificity. For instance, it specifies that it's the front of the building. That means that it's not the side, it's not the back, it has to be the front. It has to be the front. It's not the side, and it's not the back, it's the front. Okay, I can agree with that. And it also tells us that it should be imposing or decorative. That means that there's some kind of special treatment that you are associated, whether it's a material treatment or stylistic treatment or some kind of tectonic treatment that you are associating with that one side versus the others. Another expansion of the definition says, well, it could be any side of the building, and think of the Villa Rotonda by Palladio. That has 4 faces, in fact. So yes, it could be any side of a building facing a public way or space. Now here's the qualifier. It can be any side, but it must have a relationship, according to this definition, to the public domain, some public way or street or space, and finished accordingly. This references back to perhaps that there is a specialized treatment that privileges that side of the building so as to indicate that it is the face, it's the facade, or these are the facades of the building. Well, that's good. So far, so good. Now, if you go a little bit further, you find also that there is another way in which the idea of facade is applied, at least within the English language, is that when we talk about someone having a facade, we are referring to them as being somewhat superficial, that they're not serious, that they are concealing something, that it's a term that usually applies to the appearance of a person or something, that it is an illusion of some kind. The irony is that now, within the early part of the 21st century, more and more of this definition is the one that might be applied to a building surface, to what appears to be the facade but is not really a facade. So, for me, that's not sufficient answer. I need to know more than just what the dictionary tells us. We can't rely solely on language as the only sort of source of information and the only sort of source of truth in what it is that we think and what it is that how we express ourselves. And so where can we go to find, the answer to the question of what is a facade? Well, we can go to that great modern oracle, that place where we can find the answer to everything. You can go here, in fact, and find the answer to the question of what is the meaning of life. You can do that, and Google will provide you with that answer. Try it sometime. Type in, what is the meaning of life, and see what Google tells you about that. You don't have to go to the mountain. You can go to Google. Well, I went to Google recently, and I typed in architectural facade, and I got 16,900,000 hits. I thought, fantastic. Somewhere within those nearly 17 million entries, there should be the answer to the question of what is a facade, and you know what? There isn't. Now, I must be honest with you, I didn't try all 16,900,000 of them. I did the first couple of hundred, and there are traditional definitions of what a facade is, like the dictionary definition, and then everything else deals with things that are related to the facade, but not necessarily about the question of what is a facade. It talks about building technology. It talks about, it'll refer you to corporations that make facade materials and so forth, but it will not tell you, in this case, it will not tell you the answer to the question of what is a facade. So you have to narrow your search. And so I went to images. And today, you will find, if you go to images on Google under the heading of architectural facade, you get over 5 million hits. And that's encouraging. I thought, well, maybe if I go to the images, they'll tell me. Pictures of building facades will give me some sense of what a building facade is. And so I did, and I got images of buildings like this, traditional buildings, no question that that is a facade, and images of more modern buildings like Louis Kahn's Salk Center, and I would say that that is a facade. I mean, one of the things that this building does, as you should know, is that there are two of them. There's one on the other side, so there is a pair of them, two faces that are in conversation across the space and giving definition to that space and framing the view out to the Pacific Ocean. So this is a building that does have a facade, has two facades, and they are working in concert with one another to really charge that space with a sense of its physicality and also with meaning that comes through the tectonic of the concrete and the wood and the way in which light plays on those surfaces. It's a modern facade. And I also found this within those 5 million, and many more like this. This is Frank Gehry's Stata Robotics Center at MIT, and it is a facade. I would say that this qualifies as a facade, according to that traditional definition, even though this is anything but a traditional building. It does have traditional elements. You can see that, that Gehry is playing off of a kind of traditional typology of brick wall and window when he starts deforming it. So the deformation is referring back to the original. This is an idea of facade that is an interesting one. If you put all three of them together, you realize that they share things in common. They all fall into that general sort of heading of what a building facade is. But I also found buildings that look like this. Not the one over here, but this one. They call that a facade. This was under the heading of architectural facade. And so was this one, another building by Gehry. You know this is Bilbao. So the question, of course, is this a facade? Can we agree that that is the face of the building? If we think about the face in terms of how it operates in human terms, and we anthropomorphize that, we translate that to the building, is this working as a kind of communicative artifact? Or is this? I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to let you decide for yourself. Or is this a facade? A very good building that is designed explicitly to reflect the landscape. So not necessarily to make a face to the landscape, but to absorb the landscape into itself and reflect that back to the observer. Now that's an idea about surface. That's a material and tectonic idea. It's also it's a contextual idea. But is it a facade? Is it a facade? So where can we go? Maybe we can go to books. Are there books that will tell us what a facade is? So we went to Google, which is the source of all information. We will go to Amazon, which is the source of all things. And we will buy a book. We will look for a book on the building facade. I got over 21,000 hits. This is encouraging. If there are 21,000 books that are about the building facade, somewhere in there must be an answer to what is the facade. But 21,000 is a lot of books to go through. So I narrowed it down to the architectural facade, and that quickly brought it down to just 3,283 books. And I thought, well, still, that's a lot of books to go through. Let's see if I can find one that just talks about the Renaissance facade. And there were just 113 books. Most of them were guidebooks to cities in Europe where you can go see an architectural facade. They don't say anything about the architectural facade. I found 2 books out of 113 that talk specifically about the architectural facade. Now, there are a few more than just 2, but there are 2 that I found that I'm going to offer to you as good places to start reading about the architectural facade. One of them is the Renaissance Palace facade by the historian Charles Burroughs. And the other one that you may not be familiar with this one, but one that you should be familiar with is Rowe's famous Mathematics of the Ideal Villa and Other Essays. And it's the other essays that you want to read. There are 3, 4, 5 essays in that book that talk specifically about the facade as a phenomenological condition of the building surface. And they're really good articles. And it's only Colin Rowe and Tom Schumacher and a few other architects and historians over the past 50 years or so that have talked about the building facade in ways that really raise the question, of what is a facade and what is not a facade, and what does the facade do? What is the intention of the building facade? A nice quote from Burroughs is, "The facade then is a place where, in service of rhetorical effect, the corporeality of architecture is compromised." What does he mean by that? Well, I think what he's getting at is that the corporeality of architecture is the physical body of the building itself, as it's rendered in some material, brick, stone, steel, glass. It's the corporeal condition of the building, and then when you begin to mark on that, you have begun to alter the corporeality in service to a particular idea, a rhetorical effect that you may have. You're using that surface, as you would a book, to communicate information back to the observer. And in doing that, you alter the very body of the building, and you may begin to alter the way in which we perceive the body of the building. All right, now I'm going to try to give you the history of the architectural facade in 9 diagrams. You think I can do this, Jürgen? I mean, one of the things that we as teachers do, or try to do, is to present complex, difficult information in some sort of digestible form. So diagrams are a good way to do that. And so after teaching this course for a number of years, I realized that there were some basic kinds of information that the students needed to take away with them from the course, and that one way to do that is through diagrams, to reduce things down to simple equations and then allow the student to build on those equations and develop her or his complexity out of that. So diagram number 1, this is sort of biblical. In the beginning there was the wall, and the wall was without form. I'm saying that sometime 10,000 years ago, or whatever, maybe more, the human species started building walls for defensive purposes, for enclosures, for protection from the elements. And they were purely utilitarian devices. Now, Louis Kahn said that the beginning of architecture was the column, and that might be true. You cut a tree down, and you render the surface of that log, and you've begun to operate on nature in such a way that you introduce an element of intent into the material, tectonic intent, or maybe even cultural intent, and that is the beginning of architecture. I will always make the distinction between architecture over here and mere building over here. What I'm talking about today is architecture, not mere building. This is just mere building. It remains mere building until you begin to mark the surface, until you do something to that surface. And so if you were to ask me what is the first facade, I don't know that I could answer that. I can't answer that question, but I can suggest that maybe the first facade was when we made the markings on the wall. That the wall then became a record of something, of an event. It became a story that was intended to be told to future generations. It became a book of sorts, a document of communication between the person, the renderer, the one that made the mark on the wall, and then the rest of the world, the public domain. This, maybe the caves of Lascaux could be considered among the first facades ever. And what makes these wonderful, actually, is that there's also aesthetic intent. This is not just sort of expository writing. It's not just a kind of normal communication. There is aesthetic intent that the authors of these things, were intended to also represent their ability to communicate in very clear and beautiful poetic terms, that poetry enters into it, and at that point we have the beginnings of making a facade. Diagram number 2. Let's fast forward to about 3,500 years ago, and it was at a time when those buildings that represented authority of some kind began to have markings on them as well. When the authors of these buildings, the builders or the pharaohs, the potentates, the caliphs, the khans, all of those individuals of authority began to want to leave representations of their authority, their power, their intelligence, their greatness through the markings of a surface. And so Egyptian temples and mosques and buildings all the way through to the 14th century, including the great cathedrals of Europe, are all part of that phenomenon of the facade as that sort of that carrier of meaning of authority, whether it's the authority of the church, the authority of the state, or the authority of an individual. And so we can jump about 2,500 years or so, or 2,000 years, to 1400 in the next diagram. And this is that moment when ideas about facade as a representative condition of surface, as a communicative device, begin to find its way into secular architecture, into not only civil architecture, but into private architecture. That the facade of the Palazzo Farnese in Rome, I'm using here to symbolize that idea of how the owner of this building used that surface to communicate his cultivation, his wealth, his position in society, and also to make the space, and this is important, to make the space of the plaza, the piazza that is in front of this building. That space-making role, contributing to the public domain, the physical representation of the public domain as a civic space, was an important role, is an important role that building facades play. And that lasted for about 500 years or so, until about the turn of the century, about 1900, when something happened. It was one of those moments, one of those sort of guillotine moments in history. Boom, the knife comes down, and the world is never the same again. And it wasn't the war, it wasn't the plague, it wasn't anything like that. It was a simple architectural engineering device, and it was this building, or this diagram of a building technology. Now, you should know the Maison Domino diagram, and it was sort of proposed by Le Corbusier in 1916. He didn't invent this system. He didn't, invent the engineering for this diagram. That existed, in fact, as early as 1870 and probably before that. We can go back to, for instance, the Crystal Palace, as a structure of column and beam, of iron column and beam. And in fact, I can show you a photograph of buildings, factories in England in the late 18th century, in 1789, that are post and beam construction. So that technology existed for a long time, but it took Le Corbusier, it took someone like Le Corbusier to diagram it and represent it as a phenomenon, as not just a technical phenomenon, but an architectural phenomenon, as an idea about space. It creates the free plan, and it also creates, and here's that guillotine moment, the free facade. By projecting the slab out, as he does here, you can now hang the facade from the front of the building. It no longer is co-joined with structure. It's that moment when structure is pulled out of the vertical wall and moved elsewhere in the building, and what is left behind now is a thin veil that becomes the curtain wall that gets hung off of that slab. This is where everything changes. The iconic building that sort of results from this diagram, of course, is this one. And for 50 years after, from 1900 to about 1950, this was the mode of sort of construction, not of all buildings. Many bearing wall buildings were built after 1900. And many, in fact, I think you all know that neoclassicism and the Beaux-Arts tradition continued into 1950. At Syracuse University, we were still teaching the Beaux-Arts system in the early 1950s. Really, we have beautiful drawings, renderings that were done by our students in the early 50s. So it took a while before that baggage left over from the 19th century was thrown overboard, but this was one of the agents of that change. It was Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Gropius, and others like him, buildings like the Villa Garches, the Villa Stein at Garches, that began to change our attitude about the way we make a facade, and in so doing, we changed the definition of what a facade is. Between 1950 and 2000, particularly in the United States, with the advances of technology, with the growing economy after the Second World War, with the growth of corporations and corporate identity, with the need to make quick and dirty buildings, buildings that could be thrown up quickly and could be occupied and start making money, what arrives on the scene, of course, is the curtain wall facade, the glass and metal curtain wall facade, and this is the diagram that represents that technology. This is about mass production. This is about economy, efficiency. It is not about culture necessarily, although in certain cases it is. If you look at a building like Mies van der Rohe's Seagram's building, that's a beautifully designed skin. And in fact, if we had time, I might make the argument that Mies van der Rohe, in fact, was making a facade there. I haven't included any information about that, but go take a look at that building and see if you think that maybe he was thinking about this thing in facade terms. He wasn't making a dumb curtain wall, but most curtain walls built between 1950 and 2000 are dumb curtain walls. And there are hundreds of examples of that I could show you. So here we are at 2000. Between 2000 and now, this is what we're doing. And I'm using this as a very generalized diagram about a phenomenon of the building facade that has now become an issue of just simply a wrapper, a decorative wrapper, a rhetorical wrapper. In this case, the curtain wall has now become this sort of diagrid. And the diagrid, you find it everywhere. It's one size fits all. You can find it in the Prada building in Tokyo by Herzog and Demeron. You can find it in the Seattle Library in the CCTV tower by OMA. It's everywhere. And here are two examples of it. Now again, these are not bad buildings. In fact, they're really good buildings and they're interesting buildings. And they're interesting in technological terms. This is a beautifully detailed skin. And it's an exquisite object that sits on the corner in a very ordinary kind of context, so much so that it's incongruous in the way that it stands out in that context. When you approach it, you don't expect to see something like this, and that's part of the idea, that it becomes this sort of unexpected, exquisite object in this very ordinary context. And it succeeds in that way. But is it a building facade? Where is the face? Where is the front door? If you look carefully, you might be able to find it. There it is. What is this building telling us about itself, about its context, about its program, about its place within the culture? What is this building telling us? If you didn't know, would you know that this is a library? Not that buildings have to be that explicit, but this is the main branch of the public library in Seattle, Washington, yet it doesn't seem to be too concerned about how it represents itself as a kind of civic structure. It seems to be mainly concerned about how it represents the idea of program, because all these bumps and grinds and projections that you see are about the differentiation of the program within the building, and the program has worked out beautifully on this building. But where is the front door? What is the relationship of this to the scale of the context? This is human scale, and that's the building scale. Is there not a way in which buildings can be monumental, but also at the same time accommodate the difference between human scale and the building scale? What is the idea of this within that context of Seattle? These are rhetorical questions, but There are questions that the buildings raise, nonetheless. And then there is the blob. Now, I'm using the term blob here to describe a category of building that is, in some cases, amorphous or that is globular. It's not a term of derision. I'm not being critical of the shape of the building when I use the term blob. I'm just using this to describe a whole category of buildings that are not geometric. Buildings that have grown out of our fascination with parametric modeling. We now have an instrument, this incredible instrument, that allows us to build anything we imagine. Anything we imagine we can build these days. The Bilbao, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, could not have been built without a computer. It was too complex a building to manufacture all of that steel and to develop the building as an idea. I think you know that the story of Bilbao grows out of software that was taken from the aircraft industry in Europe. CATIA comes from the design of, of the French-British, joint venture for the design of those jets. Gary recognized the power of that tool, adopted it, adapted it. He now has a separate company, Gary Technologies, that is on the cutting edge of parametric modeling. So we can make these things. We can make extraordinary things. Zaha Hadid can make these incredible objects that are the swimming center at the British, at the Olympic Games this summer in Great Britain because of those machines. We can make objects like this, which are provocative. And why not? Architecture should be provocative. It sits within this rather historic context, and it demands, to be considered, as something that is sort of dominating that context. It demands that you have to come to terms with it. But where's the face? Does it make a face? Does it speak to us in any way that is articulate, that is nuanced, that is rich in its meaning? Or is it just simply a shawl, like some veil that we would place over our head? Or this building, or this building. And I could show you dozens of more of buildings that have taken this idea of the diagrid as a kind of one-size-fits-all wrapper and wrapped it around the program of the building, and this becomes the idea of the facade. Is it an idea? Or is it a quick and dirty kind of solution to the problem of what do you do with the outside of the building? Well, metaphorically, this is what I think has happened. We have taken the face, that really critical part of our body that it communicates with the rest of the world, and we've put a veil over it. And we've called that a facade. We say that that's my idea for the facade. We have blurred the facade through other kinds of means, other kinds of ways of covering the building, so that there may be some remnant of the face, but it becomes somewhat obscure. This is, by the way, do you recognize him? That's Clint Eastwood, actually. It's a famous photograph of Clint Eastwood. Go ahead, make my day. Or we have literally erased the face. And so the questions, that this raises for me is, what does it mean to do that? I mean, it's one thing to say, well, I'm erasing the face, or I'm obscuring the face. I'm creating these sort of strange optical effects. But are we doing it just simply because we can, or are we doing it because it means something? Have we arrived at a point where we have effectively obscured the face altogether and replaced it with merely some surface? And here's a building that I think does that. This is a museum in Lower Manhattan on the Bowery, not too far away from where I lived when I was a student at the Cooper Union. And it has no pretense about making a facade whatsoever. It is a series of basically mute blocks that are stacked on one another. It derives its visual interest by its contrast with the context, this old sort of slightly industrial and 19th century context. And it is covered with expanded metal, another kind of diagrid. The whole thing is covered with that, and this is what you see when you look out through the windows of the building. To me, it's a very strange thing. There is something either arrogant or unthinking about it. I mean, arrogant in the sense that the architect, a good architect, Sana, that designed this building, felt that this was sufficient, that this was enough. Now, we can maybe justify this saying, well, there was an economic sort of imperative. It was necessary for reasons of economy to make as simple and cheap a kind of wrapper for it. But I got to believe that there was other ways in which one could maybe use the same material, but still embed within the building a sense of face, of frontality, of primary orientation towards the public domain, as opposed to a box that has no particular orientation, or a series of stacked boxes. And so this is what we've done, I think, or this. Lately, there has been a great deal of interest in metal mesh facades. You've seen this probably all over. And the material has a beautiful quality about it. If you looked at really finely detailed stainless steel mesh and what you can do with it, particularly in terms of how you attach it to the facade, it can do beautiful things with the surface. I am not in any way being critical of beautiful clothing. I'm just saying that when you take the clothing and you pull it up over your face, what does that mean? So I'm arguing for a return to a more considered condition of facade and face by analogy. Colin Rowe, who you may know, you should know Colin Rowe, an historian, English historian, theoretician, and architect who taught at Cornell for many, many years and who I had the great opportunity to work with and to teach with him in Florence, wrote this about the building facade. He said, except for Le Corbusier, from time to time, face was never a preoccupation of modern architecture, nor was face as the metaphorical plane of intersection. That's a beautiful phrase. The metaphorical plane of intersection between the eyes of the observer and what one may dare to call the soul of the building. Now be careful. We're not talking literally about the soul. He's talking metaphorically about the soul of the building. That would be its internal animation and how that may or may not be expressed on the outside. A notable component, nor was it a notable component of 18th century understanding. So he's saying that as early as the 18th century, we began to forget, began to think about the facade in some ways differently. We were not thinking about it in terms of how it was this sort of communicative artifact, a co-player within the organization and the expression of the entire building. Now bear with me for a minute. Let me read to you a little text that I have here, and I have a series of slides that will go with it. And this is intended to draw out a little bit the analogy between the face and the building facade and how I see a kind of important relationship between the two. Cicero notably said that the face was the window of the soul. While that may be debatable, what is not is the fact that the human face is the most tangible and expressive component of our humanity. The face is how we see ourselves and how we recognize others. It is the primary instrument of interpersonal interaction. When we talk to one another, we generally talk to each other's face. I look in your eyes, I look at your face, and I am using that as an opportunity, your face, to get some sense of how you're reacting to what I'm saying. We do this automatically. Oh, come back. There it is. With 28 bones and 10 muscle groups, and purportedly capable of 10,000 distinctly different expressions. Scientists have determined that we are capable of making 10,000 different expressions with these 28 muscle groups and 28 bones and 10 muscle groups. The face is the most articulate and expressive part of the body. The voice issues from the face, but the face has its own grammar and vocabulary. Its language is as complex and expressive as that of any spoken. It projects to the outside world aspects of our inner self. It speaks of desires and fears, of humor and hostility, of callousness and cultivation. The face is the surface of demarcation between our public selves and our private sensibilities, between our interior life and the outer world. The word facade is derived, as such it carries the primary responsibility for negotiating with the outer world. The word facade is derived from the Latin word for face and appearance. In a sense, the building facade is to architecture as the human face is to the human race. There is an essential condition to the presence of the face. The absence of the face is unthinkable. The same could be said to be true for the building facade. As does the face, the facade serves both necessities of internal concealment and external expression. As with the face, the facade provides the observer with first impressions. It is how we principally represent and remember a building. However, the facade has an added distinction. It can also be the definer of space, as well as the instrument that charges the space with meaning. The existence of the face implicates the presence of others. Think about that. We have a face not because there is nobody else in the world. We have a face because there are other people in the world, and that face is an instrument for communication. And in evolutionary terms, it's a critical instrument for communication. Someone can tell you of danger just by the expression on their face. That is to say, the very fact of the face prefigures the existence of a society of other individuals, of other faces. And we know that the success of any society is a function of how that group of individuals is capable of cooperating with one another. By way of analogy, the architectural facade prefigures the existence of the city, of a society, as it were, of buildings each expressing its individuality through the facade. And the fact is, when we talk about the building facade, we are also talking about the city. The facade that you are designing might be for a single building sitting out in the middle of the landscape, but ultimately the whole idea of the facade is one that prefigures the existence of other facades that it works collectively with and then ultimately produces the city. A city is, in fact, a collection of building facades. Good cities are a collection of good building facades. And just as a society requires a social contract among its members, a city, to function as an effective container of social interaction, must have an architecture that recognizes its obligation to the greater whole. In this way, the facade carries a responsibility that is distinct among all other components of the building. It defines space, it gives shape, imbues it with meaning, and provides the backdrop against which the citizens can live out both their public and private lives. Now, I'm using here purposely a traditional space. This is the Grand Place in Brussels, in Belgium. And it's, if you've been there, you know it's just a beautifully defined, proportioned space. And that space exists because of a social contract called zoning laws that require that these buildings are all built at the property line so they line up with one another. It probably also specifies that the buildings are made of more or less the same material, that they're not too different from one another. It specifies cornice lines, the heights of buildings, and you'll notice at the top of the building there is an opportunity here for very individualized kind of expression. The architects of these buildings knew that, and they did it. And then within the building, there is a lot of individuation. We can say that the buildings have personalities and that we can see them expressed individually. So it's not about conforming strictly in every way, but it's about finding opportunity for differentiation within a kind of communal condition. Now, if I take this beautiful site and I introduce an object building, a blob as it were, think of what it might do to that space. Well, we can laugh at this because it is kind of a joke, but doing that with a building actually would not be a joke, and it's been done. This is Birmingham, England, much of it was destroyed during the war, downtown Birmingham, and so there are a lot of new buildings that replaced the older ones. And next to this beautiful 12th century church, there is this building. Jabba the Hutt is in Birmingham, England. And you look at that and you think, how did that happen? What happened to the zoning laws? What happened, to good common sense that would allow that building to be next to this building and to be next to these buildings and even next to this modern building over here? Well, what happened very likely is an economic imperative. Money always speaks louder than anything else, and the good folks of Birmingham were sold a bill of goods when Selfridges, an English department store, proposed to build this building and make jobs for the people who needed them in Birmingham and put shops in there. And it looks like this. Now, the detailing of this skin is really interesting. So I would not take anything away from the architects' future systems or the architects of this building of the technical virtuosity of making this form and that skin. But I will be critical of them in terms of, number one, making a building like this in that context. There's a kind of hubris about it that is disturbing. And number two, the fact that it does not have a facade. If it has any kind of a facade, here's that skin. It's this one here that looks almost like a face, and one has to wonder whether or not there was some joke attached to this. It looks elephantine a little bit, or cyclops. The irony is, over here, it says, escape to Selfridges, which means that the only way you can get away from this building is to go inside the damn thing, So. And it reminds one of projects by Archigram in the 60s, by this drawing by Ron Herron. So, I'm not necessarily critical of all blob buildings. I would say, as students, future architects, be careful of the blob, of what it can do. You can make these things with your computers, with Rhino, with Grasshopper, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. Here are some blobs. This is by Norman Foster, a very good architect. This is the City Hall of London. If I had not told you that, and you didn't know that, would you have guessed that this is the City Hall of London? It looks like a gun battery. I'm being purposely sort of dramatic here, but one would expect guns to come out of the turrets of this thing rather than this being representative of the City of London, the place of administration. And it doesn't really have a face. It does make somewhat of a gesture out to the river. Here's Tower Bridge, and so it's looking across the river at St. Paul's, but it doesn't have a face. This thing was built in Graz, Austria, by Peter Cook. He's still alive. This is from Archigram. He's still making these things. 40, 50 years later, he's making these blobs there. Now, again, this is the detailing of that skin is very interesting, but where's the facade on this building? The only thing that really saves it, I think, is the fact that there's an older building that was adaptively reused and becomes part of this one. So this is the building that actually is making the face. This one is making the mess. Or this opera house that was proposed by Jean Nouvel in St. Petersburg. I don't think this is going to be built, but where's the facade? A major cultural institution, an opera house. Where's the face? Where's the facade? Let me finish by showing you things that are happening now in the technology of the vertical surface, and the fact that these questions that I'm raising are going to continue to come up as we advance technologically and as we advance, I think, culturally and architecturally in the coming decades. We will have more and more, you as young architects will have more and more opportunity to experiment with really exotic ways of treating the surface of the building. But I would ask you to keep in mind, the question of, are you making a facade or are you decorating a surface? Are you doing something that rhetorically is interesting, or that ultimately has no real meaning outside of the gimmick? What's the word in Norwegian for gimmick? Maybe it's gimmick. This is a beautifully detailed building. You may know this. This is the famous Apple store in New York City on Fifth Avenue. This is the most busy, productive Apple store in the world, I think, as far as I know. It's open 24 hours a day, and if you go there at 4 o'clock in the morning, people are down there buying iPads and iPods, iPhones. And the glass cube is brilliant in the way that it represents, the aesthetic ambitions of Apple. But it doesn't really make a facade, and that's okay. It doesn't have to make a facade. This is a building that I will give a pass because it has no ambitions about making a facade, although there's a door that opens out to Fifth Avenue, and you can find the entrance. I'm using it here to represent the advancement of glass technology just within the past 50 years. Glass was one of the most expensive materials in the 14th and 15th century. And the bigger your windows, the more money you had. It was a representation of your wealth, the size of your windows. In this case, it's not a representation of wealth, it's a representation of aesthetic ambition and technological achievement in this case. You can make a building now entirely out of glass. You can walk on the glass. The glass beams, you can use glass to make beams, to make columns. Structural glass is an extraordinary device, but you can also make buildings that don't appear to have any kind of facade. This is a very nice building by Peter Zumthor, but it is a glass cube. The facade, if there is one, makes a space to this little plaza on the side. This is the Kunstmuseum, the Kunsthalle, also in Graz, is it?
Bregenz.
No, in Bregenz, yes. And that's the front door. That moment of threshold between inside and outside, which normally one would expect to be celebrated, is in this case a mouse hole. You can make facades, you can make vertical surfaces like this. You can make a glass wall that is basically seamless, absolutely sheer, and performative. I mean, this is a working wall. This is a multi-layered facade. And we can say that it's beautiful in its exquisiteness, in its sleekness, in its detailing. But is this the face of the building? And if it is the face of the building, what is it telling us about the building? What is it saying about itself? Now, you're looking at a building, not these buildings, but you're looking at the skin of a building that is so tightly detailed that all you see are these fine joint lines and these clips that hold the glass together. And it's reflective glass. And so during the day, when you walk by the building, you see other buildings in the context. Is this a facade? And if it is, what is the idea of that? To simply reflect the context? This is a way of dealing with an historic context by reflecting it. From where I'm standing, it looks like a cop-out. And this is a cop-out by a very good architect, by Norman Foster. This is what the building looks like at night. It's really ironic that during the day you can't see the building. It's behind this veil. At night it does a striptease. It takes its clothes off and it exposes itself, its inner space and structure, because at night it's no longer reflective. The light from the inside penetrates through to the outside. There's something a bit perverse about that as an idea. And media facades. I think you know about these. I mean, what they're doing with electric diodes, with very, very low voltage lighting, in this case, embedded within these little cylinders that are then strung on this metal mesh. You can make surfaces that change like a chameleon during the night. You can literally project images onto a surface through these LEDs, these light-emitting diodes. Or you can make a surface like this. Now there's the front door. Is this the facade? Or is it a glorified billboard? Dynamic facades are really interesting in technological terms, not just for performative reasons, but also because facades can now transform. There are facades that respond to your presence. When you walk by them, you get this kind of ghosting of your image. There are sensors in the wall that pick up your presence, that sense your presence, and begin to, in some cases, in this case, reflect the fact that you were there. Interesting ideas. And then, of course, electrochromatic glass. You probably know about this technology, but there's a type of glass that you can run an electric current through, and the glass will go from clear to opaque. Or if there is embedded within the sandwich of the glass some kind of signage or language or image, when you flip the switch, the image appears and then it disappears. So there's, what you can do with glass now is extraordinary. Or a dynamic facade like this one that can change depending upon its response to the environment, a response to use on the inside, a response to anything. You can program it to do whatever you want it to do. And now, of course, green facades. This is growing out of interest in sustainability, interest in greening the environment, bringing more foliage back into our cities. And so you will get building facades like this one, or this one, or this one. I love this one. Everybody gets a few potted plants outside their balcony, and that becomes the facade of the building. Now, your responsibility is to maintain the plants, right? If you don't take care of your plants, your neighbors know right away that you're a bad neighbor. You haven't taken care of your plants. So these turn brown, and you have to go out and buy new ones. Well, this is the end. I'm leaving you with just a few more images. This one of a building, a beautiful house for a photographer that is reduced down to absolutely the most abstracted condition of surface and space. I mean, I am really stunned by the beauty of the object and the ability to detail something like this. It looks like it's made out of corian or some plastically molded material to get that kind of detail. That's the front door. And it sits as this sort of exquisite object on top of this platform with the glowing light underneath it. It's a beautiful object. It's a beautiful object. But does it have a facade? I thought I would show you a building that you know. The Nordic embassies in Berlin. And here's a building that has a facade. Here's a modern building that uses modern materials and has a series of facades, actually, as you walk around it. And I think, here's an example of what one can do. You can satisfy your desire to create a modern building, a modern facade using modern materials, and still make a facade. And I probably don't have to talk to all of you about, the various layers of meaning that one can find in this building, in terms of the use of materials, the tectonic expression, the organization, the composition of it. I mean, the administrative entrance on the side of the building, this, of course, if you haven't been to Berlin to see this building, this is the front entrance, and this is sort of the general headquarters for all of the embassies. The other 5 Nordic embassies are organized around a courtyard, but this is where the average person comes in through that front door. This is the administrative entrance, and this is a beautifully detailed facade. It's as though the building were, that outer layer were carved away to reveal this beautiful structure on the inside. And then the whole thing is wrapped with these copper panels, creating this sort of island in the middle of this green lawn. I'll leave you with a quote by Colin Rowe. "Facade, which I can only think of as the existential interface between I and idea." The existential interface between I and idea. Thank you.